to begin the world with. I told her that she must not allow her mind to dwell upon things of this sort, being wholly against the last commandment set up in our church at Oare. Now one evening towards September, when the days were drawing in, looking back at the house to see whether Lorna were looking after me, I espied, by a little glimpse as it were, a pair of villainous fellows, about whom there could be no mistake, watching from the thicket corner, some 100 yards or so behind the good Earl's dwelling. There is mischief afoot, I thought to myself, being thoroughly conversant with theft, from my knowledge of the Doones. How will be the moon to-night, and when may we expect the watch? I found that neither moon nor watch could be looked for until the morning; the moon, of course, before the watch, and more likely to be punctual. Therefore I resolved to wait, and see what those two villains did, and save, if it were possible, the Earl of Brandir's pewter box. But inasmuch as those bad men were almost sure to have seen me leaving the house and looking back, and striking out on the London road, I marched along at a merry pace, until they could not discern me; and then I fetched a compass round, and refreshed myself at a certain inn, called the Crossbones and Buttons. Here I remained until it was very nearly as dark as pitch; and the house being full of footpads and cutthroats, I thought it right to leave them. One or two came after me, in the hope of designing a stratagem, but I dropped them in the darkness; and knowing all the neighbourhood well, I took up my position 2 hours before midnight, among the shrubs at the eastern end of Lord Brandir's mansion. Hence, although I might not see, I could scarcely fail to hear, if any unlawful entrance either at back or front were made. From my own observation, I thought it likely that the attack would be in the rear, and so indeed it came to pass. For when all the lights were quenched, and all the house was quiet, I heard a low and wily whistle from a clump of trees close by; and then 3 figures passed between me and a whitewashed wall, and came to a window which opened into a part of the servants' basement. This window was carefully raised by some one inside the house, and after a little whispering, and something which sounded like a kiss, all 3 men entered. "Oh, you villains," I said to myself, "this is worse than any Doone job, because there is treachery in it." But without waiting to consider the subject from a moral point of view, I crept along the wall, and entered very quietly after them, being rather uneasy about my life, because I bore no firearms, and had nothing more than my holly staff, for even a violent combat. To me this was matter of deep regret, as I followed these vile men inward. Nevertheless I was resolved that my Lorna should not be robbed again. Through us, or at least through our Annie, she had lost that brilliant necklace, which then was her only birthright; therefore it behoved me doubly to preserve the pewter box, which must belong to her in the end, unless the thieves got hold of it. I went along very delicately, as a man who has learned to wrestle can do, although he may weigh 20 stone, following carefully the light, brought by the traitorous maid, and shaking in her loose dishonest hand. I saw her lead the men into a little place called a pantry, and there she gave them cordials, and I could hear them boasting. Not to be too long over it, which they were much inclined to be, I followed them from this drinking bout, by the aid of the light they bore, as far as Earl Brandir's bedroom, which I knew because Lorna had shown it to me, that I might admire the tapestry. But I had said that no horse could ever be shod as the horses were shod therein, unless he had the foot of a frog, as well as a frog to his foot. And Lorna had been vexed at this, as taste and high art always are, at any small accurate knowledge; and so she had brought me out again, before I had time to admire things. Now, keeping well away in the dark, yet nearer than was necessary to my own dear Lorna's room, I saw these fellows try the door of the good Earl Brandir, knowing from the maid, of course, that his lordship could hear nothing, except the name of Alan. They tried the lock and pushed at it, and even set their knees upright; but a Scottish nobleman may be trusted to secure his door at night. So they were forced to break it open, and at this the guilty maid or woman ran away. These 3 rogues, for rogues they were, and no charity may deny it, burst into Earl Brandir's room with a light and a crowbar and firearms. I thought to myself that this was hard upon an honest nobleman, and if further mischief could be saved, I would try to save it. When I came to the door of the room, being myself in shadow, I beheld 2 bad men trying vainly to break open the pewter box, and the third with a pistol muzzle laid to the nightcap of his lordship. With foul face and yet fouler words, this man was demanding the key of the box, which the other men could by no means open, neither drag it from the chain. "I tell you," said this aged Earl, beginning to understand at last what those rogues were up for, "I will give no key to you. It all belongs to my boy Alan. No one else shall have a farthing." "Then you may count your moments, lord. The key is in your old cramped hand. 1, 2, and at 3 I shoot you." I saw that the old man was abroad, not with fear, but with great wonder, and the regrets of deafness. And I saw that rather would he be shot than let these men go rob his son, buried now, or laid to bleach in the tangles of the wood there, 3, or it might be 4 years agone, but still alive to his father. Hereupon my heart was moved, and I resolved to interfere. The thief with the pistol began to count, as I crossed the floor very quietly, while the old Earl fearfully gazed at the muzzle, but clenched still tighter his wrinkled hand. The villain, with hair all over his eyes, and the great horse pistol levelled, cried 3, and pulled the trigger, but luckily at that very moment I struck up the barrel with my staff, so that the shot pierced the tester, and then with a spin and a thwack I brought the good Holly down upon the rascal's head, in a manner which stretched him upon the floor. Meanwhile the other 2 robbers had taken the alarm, and rushed at me, one with a pistol, and one with a hanger, which forced me to be very lively. Fearing the pistol most, I flung the heavy velvet curtain of the bed across, that he might not see where to aim at me, and then, stooping very quickly, I caught up the senseless robber, and set him up for a shield and target, whereupon he was shot immediately, without having the pain of knowing it, and it was a happy thing for him. Now the other 2 were at my mercy, being men below the average strength, and no hanger, except in most skilful hands, as well as firm and strong ones, has any chance to a powerful man armed with a stout cudgel, and thoroughly practised in single stick. So I took these 2 rogues, and bound them together, and leaving them under the charge of the butler, a worthy and shrewd Scotchman, I myself went in search of the constables, whom, after some few hours, I found. Neither were they so drunk but what they could take roped men to prison. In the morning these 2 men were brought before the justices of the peace, and now my wonderful luck appeared, for the merit of having defeated and caught them would never have raised me one step in the state, or in public consideration, if they had only been common robbers, or even notorious murderers. But when these fellows were recognized, by someone in the court, as Protestant witnesses out of employment, companions and understrappers to Oates and Bedloe and Carstairs, and hand in glove with Dangerfield, Turberville, and Dugdale, in a word, the very men against whom his Majesty the King bore the bitterest rancour, but whom he had hitherto failed to catch, and when this was laid before the public with emphasis and admiration, at least a dozen men came up, whom I had never seen before, and prayed me to accept their congratulations, and to be sure to remember them, for all were of neglected merit, and required no more than a piece of luck. I answered them very modestly, and each according to his worth, as stated by himself, who of course could judge the best. The magistrate made me many compliments, 10 times more than I deserved, and took good care to have them copied, that his Majesty might see them. And ere the case was thoroughly heard, and those poor fellows were committed, more than a score of generous men had offered to lend me £100, wherewith to buy a new court suit, when called before his Majesty. Now this may seem very strange to us who live in a better and purer age, or say at least that we do, and yet who are we to condemn our fathers for teaching us better manners, and at their own expense? With these points any virtuous man is bound to deal quite tenderly, making allowances for corruption, and not being too sure of himself. And to tell the truth, although I had seen so little of the world as yet, that which astonished me in the matter was not so much that they paid me court, as that they found out so soon the expediency of doing it. In the course of that same afternoon I was sent for by his Majesty. He had summoned first the good Earl Brandir, and received the tale from him, not without exaggeration, although my lord was a Scotchman. But the chief thing his Majesty cared to know was that, beyond all possible doubt, these were the very precious fellows from perjury turned to robbery. Being fully assured at last of this, his Majesty had rubbed his hands, and ordered the boots of a stricter pattern, which he himself had invented, to be brought at once, that he might have them in the best possible order. And he oiled them himself, and expressed his fear that there was no man in London quite competent to work them. Nevertheless he would try 1 or 2, rather than wait for his pleasure, till the torturer came from Edinburgh. The next thing he did was to send for me, and in great alarm and flurry I put on my best clothes, and hired a fashionable hairdresser, and drank half a gallon of ale, because both my hands were shaking. Then forth I set, with my holly staff, wishing myself well out of it. I was shown at once, and before I desired it, into his Majesty's presence, and there I stood most humbly, and made the best bow I could think of. As I could not advance any farther, for I saw that the Queen was present, which frightened me tenfold, his Majesty, in the most gracious manner, came down the room to encourage me. As I remained with my head bent down, he told me to stand up and look at him. "I have seen thee before, young man," he said. Thy form is not one to be forgotten. Where was it? Thou art most likely to know." "May it please your most gracious Majesty."